The depot lay silent under a colourless sky, half swallowed by smoke and frost. Snow drifted in slow circles over the ruins of Aachen, settling on the twisted remains of trucks, shells, and the bones of walls that no longer stood straight. What once had been a bustling hub for the German army was now a graveyard of machinery and pride. The wind carried the dry hiss of dying fires and the faint crack of collapsing timber, echoing through the hollow streets like the voice of something that refused to die quietly. American soldiers moved through the rubble with the heavy calm of men who had seen too much, their boots crunching against frozen gravel, their breath forming pale ghosts in the cold. Among them rolled the jeeps, small, dirty, battered things that seemed out of place in the stillness, their engines coughing, their tires splattered with the filth of a continent at war. When the convoy stopped before the captured depot, the Germans inside stepped out slowly, their hands raised, faces gaunt and drained of fight. They were not soldiers, not anymore. Mechanics, engineers, the skeletal remains of a once proud corps. Their uniforms were stained with oil and soot, their eyes hollow with hunger and disbelief. One of them, an older man with silver streaks in his hair and a pair of cracked spectacles, stared at the American vehicles as if he were looking at ghosts. He took a few steps forward, hesitant, and the others followed, drawn not by defiance, but by curiosity. The jeep stood there in a line, humble, practical, nothing elegant about them. Yet in that simplicity was a quiet arrogance, the kind that spoke of a different philosophy, a different kind of power. The old engineer crouched beside one, brushing away the dirt from the leaf spring. His gloved fingers traced the suspension, the welds, the bolts, the crude geometry that somehow worked better than anything he had spent years designing. Around him, the younger Germans watched in silence, their faces marked with the dawning comprehension that they were touching something they could not have built, not because they lacked skill, but because they lacked the freedom to think that theirs was a world of over-engineered perfection, of hierarchies and signatures, of beauty built for admiration rather than endurance. But here was something that mocked that entire idea, a machine that was ugly, uneven, built to break and be fixed in minutes, forged from necessity instead of pride. One of the Americans leaning on his rifle smirked. "You boys like it?" he said. The words carried through. The Germans didn't answer. The old man merely nodded faintly, his eyes never leaving the suspension. He murmured something in German. The younger ones leaned in to listen. And when he finished, they all looked at the jeep with a new kind of reverence. The translation wasn't needed. The tone said it all. Acknowledgement, even admiration. They had built machines meant to impress generals. This one had been built to win wars. The depot smelled of oil and surrender. A bent sign still bore the Reichsadler, half torn by shrapnel, fluttering limply in the wind. Somewhere far off, artillery groaned, dull, distant thunder rolling across the horizon. But here, time felt suspended. For a brief moment, the war seemed smaller than that patch of frozen earth, where engineers and soldiers from opposite sides stood united by the same strange respect. The American, hardened and weary, looked on as the Germans circled the jeep like men at a funeral, whispering to each other, touching the metal as though trying to absorb its secret. The jeep itself seemed almost alive, scarred and scratched, yet proud. Its tires were caked with the mud of half of Europe. The canvas roof hung crooked, the paint dull beneath streaks of frost, but its spirit, if such a thing existed in steel, radiated defiance. To the American, it was just another tool of war, a thing that got them from one hellhole to the next. But to those German engineers, it was a revelation. It was the embodiment of everything that made their enemies unstoppable. Adaptability, simplicity, speed. They had tried to build perfection, and it had failed them. The Americans had built function, and it had conquered. The older engineer stood again, straightened his coat, and looked across the field at the advancing columns of olive-drab trucks and tanks. He understood in that instant that their world was collapsing, not because of ideology or manpower, but because of a philosophy too rigid to survive chaos. He whispered something under his breath, perhaps a prayer, perhaps an apology, then turned away from the jeep and faced the smoking skyline of Aachen, where the last embers of the Reich were dying in the cold wind. Behind him, one of the younger mechanics touched the jeep's hood one last time, his palm leaving a faint print on the frost. The moment was small, almost invisible, but within it was the quiet acknowledgement of defeat, not the loud kind that comes with flags lowered or signatures on surrender paper, but the kind that happens deep inside a man when he realizes that his belief in superiority has turned to dust. That morning, there were no speeches, no commands, no gunfire, just the soft sound of wind moving through broken glass and the ticking of cooling engines. The Americans smoked in silence. The Germans stood apart, and between them, the little jeep rested like an altar, a reminder that sometimes victory is built not from power, but from understanding what doesn't need to be perfect to endure. So, tell me in the comments, from where are you watching this story today? The day wore on slowly, the light dimming into that grey, uncertain hour between afternoon and dusk, when even the snow seemed to hesitate before falling. Smoke lingered over the shattered horizon of Aachen, curling upward like the last fragile threads of a dying world. Inside the captured depot, the Americans began setting up camp, stacking crates, inspecting the wrecked vehicle, clearing debris with the mechanical rhythm of men who had learned to survive by staying busy. Every clang of metal echoed in the cold, each sound sharp and brittle against the silence of surrender. The jeeps sat in a line near the gate, engines ticking softly as they cooled, their silhouettes cut sharp against the glow of the fires the soldiers had lit to keep warm. On the other side, the German engineers huddled together, still guarded by a pair of riflemen, but left enough space to sit, to breathe, to think. Their faces, illuminated by the pale flames, looked older than their years, worn by hunger, disbelief, and the quiet realization that everything they had built, every design and dream polished under the banner of the Reich, was now meaningless. The older man with the grey hair sat apart from the others, his mind wandering through the wreckage of memory. He had designed engines once, sleek, intricate, the kind that purred with mathematical precision. He had believed in structure, in perfection, in the flawless harmony of parts. Yet here, on the frozen ground of a defeated city, he had seen something that shattered that belief, a crude, almost primitive machine that embodied a kind of genius he had never been allowed to imagine. The American Jeep was not built for beauty. It was built for survival. It was built for the soldier who had to fix it with nothing but a wrench and a curse in the middle of a battle. It was built for imperfection, and that was its perfection. Across the yard, a young American sergeant named Miller sat on the hood of one of those jeeps, eating from a tin of cold rations, his helmet tilted back. He was barely 22, but the war had aged him into something harder, quieter. He looked at the Germans occasionally, not with hatred, but with a strange, distant pity. He had fought them in hedgerows and cities, watched friends die under their artillery, but seeing them now, thin, broken men staring into the fire, he could not bring himself to feel triumph. It all felt too hollow for that. He knew that the war was nearing its end, though no one dared to say it aloud. The rumors were everywhere, Hitler hiding in Berlin, the Russians closing in from the east, the Allies tightening their grip. But in the middle of that depot, surrounded by the ruin of both sides, the notion of victory seemed meaningless. All that remained were men and machines, each carrying its own story of exhaustion. Miller watched as the grey-haired engineer stood and walked toward the jeep once more, his steps slow, deliberate. The guards didn't stop him. He crouched beside the front wheel again, brushing his fingers over the mud-caked metal, and said something in German. Miller didn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable, reverent, almost mournful. The old man spoke to one of the younger engineers, gesturing toward the suspension, explaining something with calm, measured precision, as though he were teaching a lesson for the last time. The younger man nodded, eyes fixed on the mechanism, absorbing every word, perhaps realizing that this, the simplicity of his enemy's creation, would shape the future far more than any blueprint he had followed before. It began to snow again, faint at first, then heavier, flakes gathering in the creases of their uniform and on the bare steel of the jeeps. The fire hissed and spat. The Americans drew their coats tighter, their faces half lit by the glow. For a moment, the war seemed to retreat beyond the walls, and what remained was something fragile, almost human. The shared understanding of men who built and destroyed for reasons none of them could still justify. The German engineers whispered among themselves, their voices soft and resigned. One of them produced a small notebook from his coat, a tattered thing held together by wire, and began sketching, quickly, with the shaky urgency of someone trying to capture a truth before it slipped away. The drawing was crude, but clear. The outline of the jeep's suspension, its shape traced with care. Miller noticed it, said nothing. He knew that kind of look, the look of a man realizing he's been wrong his entire life. By the time the snow had blanketed the yard in pale white, the two sides had fallen into a strange peace. The Americans worked quietly, their laughter subdued, their songs replaced by the low murmur of conversation. The Germans no longer looked like prisoners, just men stripped of flags and cause. Somewhere deep down, both sides knew they were witnessing a moment that would never be written into history books, the quiet intersection of defeat and understanding. The Jeep, resting between them, was no longer just a vehicle. It had become a symbol of the war's turning tide, of what endurance and adaptability could do against arrogance and over-design. The night deepened. Miller finished his meal and tapped the hood beside him. "You know," he said to the corporal next to him, "those fellas build tanks that could climb a wall but can't fix a flat without permission." The corporal laughed quietly, shaking his head. "Yeah, guess that's what happens when you think too hard about everything." Miller glanced toward the Germans again. The grey-haired engineer had fallen silent, his eyes distant, his hands folded. He looked smaller now, diminished not by defeat alone, but by understanding. The realization that his entire nation had built machines the way it built ideals, perfect in theory, doomed in practice, had finally settled in. The cold grew sharper, the sky darker, and the wind carried the faintest echo of artillery from miles away. But no one in that depot spoke of the war anymore. For that brief night, surrounded by wreckage and silence, they were simply men sharing the same weary truth, that everything built to dominate eventually breaks, and what survives are the things simple enough to be rebuilt. And so the old engineer sat beside the American Jeep until the fire went out, his face ghostly in the pale snowlight, staring at the machine that had quietly rewritten everything he believed about strength. If this story makes you stop and think about how even the smallest things can define the fate of nations, then subscribe, because there are stories like this one, buried all across the ruins of that war. Morning came grey and bitter, with the wind cutting through the ruined depot like a knife. The snow had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving behind a world muted in white and ash. Smoke still rose in thin trails from the heart of Aachen, drifting over the fields toward the horizon, where the front waited. The American column was preparing to move again. Men shouted through the cold, their breath clouding in the air as they packed supplies, checked engines, and loaded ammunition. The jeeps came alive one by one, coughing, rattling, shivering like living things that refused to rest. Every sound, a wrench dropped, a door slammed, a radio crackling to life, seemed to echo with the promise of motion, of another road, another fight. Miller was up early, his uniform stiff with frost, his fingers raw and red. He walked the line of vehicles, checking the tires, the engines, the cargo. The jeep he'd sat on the night before was still there, gleaming faintly under a crust of ice, its hood marked by the faded outline of a German handprint. He brushed it away and paused for a moment, staring at it, at the simplicity of the machine that carried them through mud, through blood, through the unending noise of war. Around him, the men moved like ghosts of habit. Jenkins, the driver, was cursing about the cold as he tried to warm the engine. Corporal Hayes was muttering a prayer over his coffee. The war had burned the humanity out of them, one layer at a time, and yet, there in the small rituals of preparation, something still survived, the stubborn instinct to keep going. Across the yard, the German engineers stood in a line under guard, waiting to be transported to a rear camp. The grey-haired one looked smaller in daylight, shrunken by the loss of night's shadows. His eyes followed the American's movement, not with fear, but with the detached calm of a man watching the future roll forward without him. He saw in those jeeps, in their rough welds, their patched tires, their clattering defiance, a symbol of everything his country had failed to understand. Germany had tried to perfect, to sculpt it with mathematics and ideology, but war had turned out to be a creature too wild for perfection. It belonged to those who adapted, who improvised, who built for function and not for glory. The Americans began to roll out. Engines revved, tires spun, and the convoy slowly crawled toward the broken road that cut through the city's carcass. Miller climbed into the passenger seat, rifle slung across his lap, eyes scanning the rooftops out of habit. Even though Aachen had fallen, they all knew danger still hid in the cracks. Snipers, stragglers, desperate men unwilling to surrender. The Germans watched them, silent. As the convoy passed, the old engineer raised his hand, not a salute, not even a wave, just a slow gesture of acknowledgement, like a man bidding farewell to a ghost. For the next few miles, the jeeps bounced and growled across a landscape that barely resembled Earth. Roads had become trenches, trees had been shredded into splinters, and the fields were a graveyard of machines. Tanks burned to hollow shells, trucks twisted and half buried in snow. The sky hung low, heavy with the promise of another storm. Miller's jeep led the second section, its windshield cracked, its engine coughing with each climb, and yet it moved, as it always did, stubbornly unstoppable. Behind them followed a column of heavier vehicles, half-tracks, ammo carriers, medics, all crawling east toward the Siegfried Line. The war was not done with them yet. They passed through a small village that had once been beautiful. Cobblestone streets, red roofs, church bells. Now it was only dust and smoke. A woman stood among the ruins of what had been her home, wrapped in a torn blanket, a child clinging to her leg. She didn't speak, didn't move, just watched them go by with eyes that carried the same emptiness Miller had seen in the prisoners. He looked away, guilt flickering briefly across his face before duty hardened it again. None of them could afford to feel too much. Feeling got you killed. Still, he couldn't shake the thought that somewhere, in some other world, that woman might have been his mother, and the men driving past her might have been German. War blurred everything until right and wrong dissolved into survival. As they left the village, gunfire cracked from the tree line ahead. The convoy jerked to a halt, soldiers spilling from their vehicles, rifles raised. The air froze, every sound magnified, the click of a safety, the creak of boots in snow. Miller dropped behind the jeep, his heart pounding, eyes scanning the ridgeline. Another shot. A bullet pinged off the hood, throwing sparks. Jenkins cursed, ducking behind the wheel. "Snipers!" someone shouted. The woods came alive with echoing cracks, flashes of light between the bare branches. The Americans returned fire, their rifles barking sharp and quick. Miller sighted down his barrel, caught a glimpse of movement, squeezed the trigger. The man in the tree line fell backward in a spray of snow. It lasted only a few minutes, but it felt like hours. When the shooting stopped, the silence that followed was deafening. The air smelled of cordite and pine. A medic hurried past, dragging a wounded man whose leg was slick with blood. The jeeps idled, their engines rumbling nervously, waiting to move again. Miller wiped his face, his breath fogging in the cold, and leaned against the hood, feeling the warmth of the engine through his gloves. The same jeep that had carried him through Normandy, through France, through fire and ice, had just saved him again, its steel body taking the bullets meant for his chest. He looked at the fresh dents along the fender and felt something strange twist in his chest. Gratitude. When the road was clear, the convoy rolled on. The bodies of 2 German stragglers lay half buried in the snow beside the trees, their rifles frozen in their hands. No one stopped. There was no time for pity. The war was devouring everything, men, machines, ideas, and no one could slow it down. But as Miller's jeep bounced over the ruts, he thought about the old engineer back in Aachen. He wondered if the man was still alive, if he still believed in anything after seeing what defeat looked like. The memory of that silent gesture, that half-raised hand, stayed with him like a ghost. By nightfall, they reached the next forward position, a bombed-out farmhouse serving as a temporary outpost. The sky was purple with dusk, the snow glowing faintly under the light of flares. The jeeps pulled in one by one, mud frozen on their wheels. The soldiers climbed out, shoulders heavy, eyes hollow. They were winning the war, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival stretched too thin. The jeeps cooled beside them, engines ticking, radiators hissing, the heartbeat of a force too tired to celebrate. That night, as Miller sat near the fire with the others, he could hear the faint ticking of metal outside, the whisper of wind through broken windows, the soft murmur of men trying to remember who they were before the war. He reached into his coat and took out a small wrench, a keepsake he'd found in the depot the day before. It had belonged to one of the German engineers. He turned it in his hand, feeling its cold weight, and wondered if maybe they weren't so different after all. Men trying to build something that could survive them. Outside, the jeeps stood under the falling snow, their shadows stretching across the ruins. They were more than machines now. They were witnesses, rolling across a dying world, carrying soldiers who no longer believed in glory, only in endurance. The next morning broke with a dull rumble that seemed to come from the bones of the earth itself. The farmhouse shook as artillery thundered somewhere beyond the hills, and the men scrambled to their stations before the frost had even melted their coats. Dawn light spilled through cracks in the wall, pale and merciless, revealing faces drawn tight with fatigue. The jeep stood ready by the road, engines coughing steam into the frozen air, tires half buried in slush. Each one bore the scars of yesterday, bullet holes patched with tin, shattered lights replaced with tape, canvas roofs flapping in the wind like torn flags. They looked like survivors themselves, beaten but unbroken. Orders came fast, shouted over the roar of engines and distant shellfire. A push toward the Siegfried Line, the last wall before Germany's heart. The column formed in silence, the soldiers grim, their movements efficient but heavy. Miller climbed into his seat, the wrench he'd kept from the depot tucked into his pocket like a charm. Jenkins hit the ignition, and the Jeep rattled to life, vibrating with a low growl that echoed through Miller's chest. They rolled out through the snow-choked road, past the smouldering husk of the farmhouse, heading toward the forest ahead, where smoke already smeared the horizon. The road narrowed, twisting between shattered trees and abandoned trenches. Every few hundred yards, they passed the remnants of battle, burned-out panzers, overturned trucks, the blackened skeletons of men and machines frozen together in grotesque shapes. The war had reduced everything to fragments, and yet the column moved forward as if driven by something older than fear. Miller's eyes flicked constantly between the tree line and the horizon. He could feel the tension humming through his body, the same rhythm he'd lived with since Normandy, that quiet before the storm, that knowledge that death was waiting just ahead, silent and patient. It came fast. The first mortar fell without warning, a dull thud that sent up a geyser of snow and earth, rocking the lead vehicles off the road. The air filled with shouts, the metallic scream of twisting steel, the staccato rattle of machine guns from the forest. "Ambush!" someone yelled, and the column dissolved into chaos. Miller and Jenkins ducked instinctively as bullets tore through the windshield, glass spraying like ice. The Jeep lurched sideways, its tires spinning in the mud as Jenkins fought to keep control. The forest erupted with muzzle flashes, the air thick with smoke and the acrid sting of cordite. Miller threw open the door and hit the ground, rolling behind the Jeep for cover. Snow exploded around him as rounds chewed into the ground. He could hear Jenkins cursing, the rattle of his Thompson as he returned fire, the sound of engines drowned beneath the chaos. Shouts, screams, the thundering crack of artillery. A half-track up ahead took a direct hit, blooming into fire and shrapnel that rained down over the road. Men dove for ditches, some too slow. The smell of burning fuel filled the air, thick and suffocating. Miller shouted over the noise, motioning for Jenkins to move. The driver jumped out, ducking behind the Jeep, as another burst of gunfire tore through the canvas roof. "We've got to push forward," Miller yelled. "We stay, we're dead." Jenkins nodded, reloading with shaking hands. Together, they climbed back into the Jeep, engine still sputtering, and slammed it into gear. The vehicle jolted forward, sliding through mud and ice, weaving between wrecks and fallen trees as bullets pinged off the hood. Miller fired into the tree line, short bursts, the recoil jarring through his arms. He caught glimpses of figures, German paratroopers in white camouflage, ghost-like among the snow. They were fighting like men, with nothing left to lose. The convoy scattered, some vehicles veering off-road, others crushed by debris. Smoke hung so thick it turned the daylight grey. The Jeep bounced over a crater, nearly flipping, then landed hard, tires clawing for grip. Jenkins drove blind, eyes narrowed against the snow and ash. Miller could barely hear himself think, the roar of engines and gunfire collapsing into a single deafening sound that felt more like vibration than noise. They burst through a patch of trees and onto open ground. A field churned to mud and frozen corpses. Ahead, a tank lay half sunk, its turret blown open like a wound. "Keep going!" Miller shouted. Jenkins pressed harder, the engine screaming, until another explosion tore the ground beside them, flipping the Jeep onto its side. The world went white, then black. Miller hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the air from his lungs. He tasted dirt and blood, his ears ringing, his vision swimming. Somewhere nearby, Jenkins was shouting his name, half buried under the Jeep's frame. Miller crawled toward him, dragging himself through the mud, hands slipping on frozen earth. The Jeep hissed steam from its cracked radiator, its front wheels still spinning weakly, whining like an animal in pain. He reached Jenkins, who was pinned by the leg but alive, his face twisted in agony. "Don't you quit on me," Miller said, voice hoarse. He braced himself and heaved against the Jeep's frame. It groaned but didn't move. He tried again, muscles screaming, until the weight finally shifted enough for Jenkins to crawl free. The driver collapsed beside him, gasping, clutching his bleeding leg. The battle raged on around them, tracers cutting through the smoke, the ground shaking under shell fire. The Jeep lay broken between them, steam rising from its crushed body, but it had shielded them from the blast. They lay there for what felt like hours, the noise ebbing and flowing, until the sound of engines changed, deeper, heavier. American armor. The counterattack had arrived. Shermans burst through the smoke, their cannons thundering, machine guns sweeping the tree line. The Germans broke, their white figures vanishing into the forest, leaving behind the dead and the burning. The roar of battle faded into groans and static, and the only sound left was the wind moving through the shattered field. Miller sat up slowly, his whole body aching. He looked at the jeep, the same machine that had carried them across half of Europe, now lying broken, half buried in mud. The hood was dented, the windshield gone, but somehow, absurdly, the engine still made a faint ticking sound, like a heartbeat refusing to stop. He placed his hand on the fender, feeling the warmth fading from the metal, and for a strange moment it felt like saying goodbye to an old friend. Jenkins laughed weakly beside him, the kind of laugh that came more from disbelief than humor. "She got us through one more, huh?" Miller nodded. "Yeah," he said softly. "She always does." Medics arrived soon after, hauling the wounded back toward the road. The snow had begun again, falling gently over the carnage, softening the outlines of the dead. The battlefield grew quiet, the chaos dissolving into a silence so deep it almost hurt. Miller looked around at the wrecks, the craters, the lifeless trees. All of it, every burned vehicle, every body, seemed to blur together, a single vision of exhaustion. And yet in the middle of it, that broken jeep stood like a monument to stubbornness, a symbol of the kind of strength that wasn't beautiful but endured. As they pulled Jenkins onto a stretcher, Miller lingered for a moment longer beside the wreck. He thought of the German engineer again, of those hands tracing the suspension in wonder. Maybe the old man had understood something that Miller was only beginning to grasp, that greatness wasn't built from perfection, but from persistence, from machines and men that refused to stop, no matter how broken they became. The snow thickened, muffling everything, turning the battlefield into a ghostly landscape of white and steel. The medics called for him, and Miller finally turned away, trudging through the mud toward the waiting trucks. Behind him, the jeep rested quietly, its frame slowly disappearing beneath the falling snow, its engine's last warmth fading into the cold. In that silence, the war felt both infinite and over. Comment below. If you had been in Miller's place, watching that jeep die after carrying you through hell, what would you have felt? Write it like this: "I think I'd have felt," and finish the sentence. The convoy limped eastward for 2 more days before orders pulled them back behind the line. They left the broken jeep where it lay, half buried in snow and shrapnel, its shape slowly vanishing under the grey sky. Miller kept looking back until the wreck disappeared behind the trees. He felt as if a piece of himself had been left there, the stubborn heart of the machine that had survived everything he couldn't explain. The roads that followed were quiet, but cruel. Every village they passed smelled of smoke and hunger. Faces watched from shattered doorways, children with eyes too old, women wrapped in threadbare coats, men who no longer cared who won. The war was shrinking to embers, but those embers still burned everyone they touched. They stopped one evening in a valley that had once been a farm. The barns were gone, the fields littered with rusted shells and churned earth. The company made camp among the ruins, small fires flickering in the wind. The soldiers spoke little. They sat in clusters, rubbing their hands over the flames, trading cigarettes, whispering names that didn't answer any. Miller found himself staring at the stars, pale, distant, untouched by everything below. He thought about the old engineer again, the way the man's fingers had traced the jeep's suspension as if it were the pulse of a living thing. He wondered if that man had lived long enough to see his country fall. He wondered if, somewhere in the ruins of Aachen, someone had salvaged that same jeep, patched its wounds, and made it move again. Jenkins lay nearby, leg bandaged, pale but breathing. He kept talking in a low, drowsy voice, rambling about home, a gas station in Ohio, a girl who wrote letters that never arrived. The words drifted into the night, soft as the crackle of the fire. Miller listened without answering. He didn't trust himself to speak. There were no words that made sense anymore. Everything he had once believed about the war, about right, wrong, courage, had melted into something quieter. Survival wasn't noble. It was just stubbornness wearing a human face. Later, when the others had fallen asleep, he walked down to what remained of a stream. The water moved sluggishly, carrying flakes of ash from some distant burning. He crouched there for a long time, listening. In that silence, he began to notice the smaller sounds again. The rustle of wind through the broken reeds, the slow creak of cooling metal from the vehicles above, the distant cough of a sentry. The war was still there, but fainter, like an echo trying to remember itself. He realized he no longer feared it. Fear had burned out of him somewhere between Normandy and that frozen field. What was left was emptiness, not peace, not yet, but something close to it. At dawn, orders came to move out again. Jenkins couldn't travel, so a medic truck stayed behind with him. Miller stood by the tailgate, staring at his friend's face, trying to memorize it. "See you down the road," Jenkins said, forcing a grin. Miller nodded, but they both knew there might be no road left to meet on. The Jeep he was assigned now was newer, cleaner, unfamiliar. When he climbed into the passenger seat, he felt nothing. The steering wheel, the engine's hum, all of it sounded wrong, too smooth. He missed the rattle, the cough, the life of the old one. Machines had souls when you needed them to, and that one had carried his through hell. The day stretched endless, grey sky pressing low, the landscape bleeding colour. They passed through forests stripped bare by shells, through towns where the walls leaned like weary men. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang, cracked and lonely. Miller wondered how many times that bell had sounded over battles, how many prayers it had outlived. Around noon, they stopped at a crossroads where a column of German prisoners was being herded west. Most were little more than boys, their faces pinched with cold and disbelief. One of them looked up as the jeeps idled past, blonde, maybe 17, and for an instant, their eyes met. There was no hate there, only recognition. Both were caught in the same storm, both trying to understand how something so vast could end with so few left standing. By the time night fell again, the company reached a ridge overlooking a river valley glowing faintly under the moon. Beyond that, water lay Germany's heartland, the factories, the cities, the end. They set up camp in the ruins of another farmhouse. Miller volunteered for watch duty. He sat by the doorway, rifle resting across his knees, the wind creeping through the gaps in the stone. Down below, the river moved like molten steel, silent and slow. Somewhere beyond it, men were dying, still believing the war could be won. But here, on this ridge, the war already felt like a memory too heavy to carry. He took the wrench from his pocket, turned it over in his hands. It was smeared with dried mud, its metal dulled by frost. He thought of the engineer again, and for the first time, he felt something close to gratitude, not for the enemy, but for the shared understanding that came too late. That even across the line, men were bound by the same instinct, to build, to survive, to leave something that worked. Maybe that was the only truth left after all the speeches and banners had burned away. The wrench glinted in the moonlight, and he realized it was the only souvenir he wanted to keep. Not medals, not photos, just that, a piece of the war that still made sense. When dawn came, he was still awake. Frost clung to his helmet, and the river had turned to silver under the pale sun. Trucks started their engines, voices rose, the machine of war grinding forward once more. But before he climbed aboard, Miller walked to the edge of the ridge and looked east. The sky was clear, impossibly wide, and for the first time in years, he could imagine a day without the sound of engines. He slipped the wrench back into his pocket and whispered something no one heard. Not a prayer, not a promise, just a quiet thank you to the ghost of a machine that had carried him through the worst of it. The column rolled out again, their tracks cutting fresh scars into the frozen ground. Behind them, the farmhouse crumbled a little more, and the wind scattered ashes through the valley. The war was still alive, but its heart was slowing. The men rode on, half awake, half remembering, waiting for the moment when the noise would finally stop. And somewhere, beneath a field of snow and steel, the old Jeep slept, rusting, silent, undefeated. When the shooting finally stopped, it didn't end with music or flags. It ended the way a machine dies, slowly, unevenly, with strange noises that fade into nothing. For days the front fell quiet. The men didn't believe it at first. They waited for the next shell, the next order, the next scream. None came. The silence felt dangerous, almost obscene, after years of sound. Trucks moved without headlights. Radios crackled with rumors. Berlin surrounded, Hitler gone, the Reich broken into dust. No one cheered. They just sat there, staring at the ground, as if afraid that any movement would wake the war again. Miller sat beside a river that no longer smelled of smoke. Spring had come shyly, with small bursts of green pushing through the mud. The air was different, still cold, but clean, untainted by gunpowder. He had been transferred to an occupation unit, given a desk in what used to be a German schoolhouse. There were papers now instead of rifle, names to file, civilians to question. He hated it. He missed the hum of the Jeep, more than he'd ever thought he could miss a machine. The silence of peace was not peace at all. It was emptiness, wearing a clean face. At night, he walked the roads outside the town, through fields still littered with helmets and rusted cans. The moonlight turned everything silver. Sometimes he thought he could hear engines far away, the ghosts of convoys moving through the dark. He would stop, listen, wait for the echo to fade. Then he'd feel the wrench in his pocket, the weight of it grounding him in the present. It had become something like a compass, a reminder that survival wasn't victory, just continuation. He saw the German engineer again, months later, by chance. The man had survived the capture and now worked under supervision repairing Allied vehicles. His hair was whiter, his body thinner, but his hands still moved with careful precision. Miller didn't know what to say when their eyes met. The engineer smiled faintly, wordlessly, and gestured toward the Jeep chassis he was working on, an American one, stripped and waiting for new parts. For a moment they stood on opposite sides of the same wreck, two men bound by steel, not flags. Then the engineer went back to work, and Miller walked away without speaking. That brief look said enough. The war had taught them both the same truth. Nothing built to last ever truly belongs to one side. Days passed. Some men drank themselves quiet. Others wrote letters that felt like confessions. The camp filled with laughter that sounded wrong, too forced, like they were pretending they'd forgotten how to grieve. Miller kept his distance. He fixed small things. An engine that wouldn't start, a jammed door, a broken radio, anything that made him feel useful again. Every time his hands touched a bolt or a wrench, the noise of battle came back. The roar, the smoke, the heartbeat of engines pushing through chaos. It wasn't nostalgia. It was memory reminding him who he'd become when everything else was stripped away. One evening, he found himself driving again. Not a Jeep this time, but a captured German truck assigned for supply runs. It felt wrong under his hands. Too polished, too obedient. He missed the defiance of the Willys, the way it had rattled like it was laughing at death. He parked by a bridge that had been rebuilt with Allied lumber and sat on the hood, watching the sun sink behind the hills. Below him, the river glowed copper and red. He thought of Jenkins, of all the men who hadn't made it past that last winter. He thought of the old Jeep, still lying under snow somewhere near the Siegfried line, and imagined it rusting quietly into the soil, part of the land now, part of the silence. The sound of boots broke his thought. A boy, German, maybe 14, was walking along the riverbank, collecting bits of scrap to trade. The kid stopped when he saw Miller, unsure whether to run or salute. Miller waved him closer, reached into his pocket, and handed him the wrench. The boy looked at it, confused. "Keep it," Miller said, his voice low. "Build something that works." The boy nodded, clutching it like a relic, and ran off down the road. Miller watched him go, until he disappeared among the ruins. For the first time in years, he felt something small and almost forgotten move inside his chest. Not joy, but hope's quieter cousin. That night, as darkness spread over the valley, the wind carried no echoes of war, only the faint rustle of leaves returning to life. The men in camp slept without fear for the first time, their rifles stacked and untouched. Miller lay awake, staring at the rafters of the old schoolhouse, listening to the hum of the world repairing itself. Somewhere out there, he knew, more machines were already being built, better, faster, cleaner, but he also knew they'd never carry the same kind of soul. That belonged to a different time, a dirtier time, when men learned what endurance really meant. He closed his eyes, the sound of an engine faint and imaginary in his ears, and let the silence settle over him like a blanket. Tomorrow would come, and with it, the uneasy work of rebuilding. But for tonight, the war was gone, and all that remained was the memory of steel, mud, and a machine that refused to die. Decades passed. The world turned and rebuilt itself, the way Earth always swallows its own scars. Roads that had once carried columns of jeeps and tanks now carried families, trucks full of fruit, laughter. The war became stories, then textbooks, then silence. But some memories refused to rust. They lived quietly in the corners of old men's minds, like a machine still idling somewhere out of sight. Miller lived long enough to see the country he fought through bloom again. He came back to Europe years later, grey-haired and slow, part of a veteran's tour. They called it revisiting history. He called it remembering what you can't forget. The buses stopped near Aachen, where the fields were green again and houses stood straight. Children waved. Someone played a brass band. It felt wrong, almost indecent, that so much light could exist in a place that had once been nothing but smoke. He walked away from the group, down a narrow road lined with new trees. The air smelled of rain and diesel. Somewhere nearby, a farmer was ploughing with a machine that hummed the same low rhythm as the jeeps had. Every sound brought pieces of the old world back, the crunch of tires over mud, the crack of frost, Jenkins' laugh, the metallic cough of an engine that refused to die. The field was smaller than he remembered, the landscape softened by time. He found the place by instinct more than sight. a dip in the ground where snow had once buried the wreck. The earth had swallowed almost everything. Only a fragment of rusted steel peeked through the grass, the curve of a fender, the ghost of paint worn away by rain. He knelt slowly, the bones in his knees protesting, and brushed the dirt with his hand. The metal was warm from the sun. For a moment, he could smell the war again, the oil, the smoke, the sweat. He could hear the engine ticking after a long day's run, the sound of survival. He stayed there a long time, not thinking, just breathing. Around him, the wind moved through the grass the way it used to move through smoke. He realized then that the war hadn't ended in 1945. It had only changed shape. It lived in the silence between seconds, in the weight of the world built over its graves. He wasn't proud of it, not really. Pride was for men who hadn't seen the cost. What he felt was something quieter, understanding, that everything good, every piece, every road, every machine, was born from something that refused to break. As he rose to leave, something caught his eye. A boy riding past on a bicycle, a flash of sunlight on metal. For a heartbeat, Miller thought he saw it again. The curve of the old Jeep's grille, the same stubborn shape, alive in motion. He smiled, not because he believed in ghosts, but because some machines never really die. They just keep moving, passed from one generation to the next, carrying new lives through the same roads. When he got back to the bus, the others were waiting. A journalist asked him the same question they always ask. What do you remember most about the war? He thought about it. The noise, the faces, the fire, the frozen rivers. Then he said, a machine we called a Jeep. It was ugly, simple, loud, but it never quit. It carried us when nothing else would. The journalist smiled politely, wrote it down, not understanding. How could she? The Jeep wasn't just steel and bolts. It was will made visible, the stubborn heartbeat of men too young to die and too old to give up. The bus pulled away, heading toward the city. Miller looked out the window at the fields rolling past, green and endless. Somewhere under that soil, pieces of the war slept, rifles, helmets, bones, and a small American machine that once carried the weight of an army. He wondered if the earth remembered too, if the roots and stones whispered stories to each other when no one was listening. When the city lights appeared, he leaned his head against the glass and closed his eyes. In the hum of the bus engine, he could still hear it, that same rough rhythm, that small, defiant sound that had once cut through snow and gunfire. It made him smile. The world had changed. The machines were faster, cleaner, quieter, but none of them had that sound, that life, that soul. He whispered, half to himself, keep going, old girl. It was a goodbye, and a thank you both. Outside, the road stretched ahead, smooth and endless, carrying him home one last time. That was the end of the veteran's story, and the beginning of peace that never really felt like peace, only motion after stillness. If you felt something reading this, like the weight of stories that refuse to fade, hit like and subscribe, because there are hundreds more still buried in the mud of that war, waiting to be remembered.